Okay, so I'll introduce myself for all of you and for anyone who may be watching this in the future. My name is Newt Warren. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Viking Union Gallery. And tonight we're celebrating the opening of both Inside Out and Outside In, the coinciding sister shows of the 2021 BFA cohort, which is really exciting. They're both online. There's similar work in both, but it's a little something different from each show. And tonight we'll be mostly talking about Inside Out because that's a show at the VU Gallery, but any and all comments and questions are welcome. Okay, looks like we have a pretty full house. So I would like for the members of the BFA who are here to introduce themselves. And I've got 2 pages of folks on my Zoom. So I'll let one of y'all start it off and then pass it off to another person that you see. And hopefully we can get through everyone here.
I can start off, Newt. Hi, I'm Nicole Sletta. I'm one of the members of the BFA, obviously. And I focus in sculptural and installation art. I'll send it to Emma, who's next to me.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm also one of the members of the BFA, and I focus in mixed media collage. And I'll send it to Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I use they, them pronouns, and my focus is in oil painting, and I'll send it to Henry.
Hey, I'm Henry. I also use they, them pronouns, and I focus mostly on environmentally themed mixed media sculpture and installation. Oh, and I'll send it to Haley.
I'm Haley. I work in acrylic painting and digital works, and I worked on the website for one of the shows. Yeah, and I'll send it to Mia.
Hi, my name's Mia. I am focused in video and editing and time-based art. And I'll send it to Izzy.
I focus mainly on printmaking and fabric installation, and I will send it to Amanda.
I'm focusing mostly on mixed media and fabric sculpture, and I guess I'll send it to Daniil.
Hi, I'm Daniil, and I focus on sculpture like Henry, with a little bit of photography. And there's no one to pass it to.
Okay, cool. I think we can get into it unless, is Cara here? Does Cara want to introduce herself?
Hi. Let's see. I am here. Can you see me? Yeah, I'm here. I'm the BFA coordinator, everybody. It's good to see you all. And I'm excited for this discussion. Thanks, Newt, for giving us the platform and the stage to show the work of the BFA students.
Awesome, thanks, Cara. And thanks everyone for taking the time to introduce yourselves. So this is pretty informal. Feel free to speak however you normally would. I just have a handful of questions that are aimed towards the group, so anyone can answer. I realize that that's kind of hard in Zoom, so we'll just kind of feel it out. And then, of course, if any of our audience members have any questions, enter them in the chat, and then we'll try to get to all of those by 8. So let's get started. My first question for the group is, could you talk about some of the challenges that y'all are facing while working during the pandemic? And what are some of the solutions that you're utilizing to complete the BFA program despite these challenges?
I can go ahead and answer this one, or start the answering. I think for me, the hardest part has been having like limited access to like physical feedback. So much of my work like depends on interacting with it in a kind of physical way. And I miss being able to like go grab someone and just bring them to the work and like have them give me kind of feedback on the spot instead of like taking photos and waiting for critique. So I don't know. I guess it's been like the strategies to get around that has been like just making the best of those opportunities when someone can come and see my work, and trying to make those those chances for feedback like really useful, and to think about what kind of feedback I want more than I might have previously.
I can jump in here. I think one of the struggles with working during the pandemic is kind of losing that sense of community and being able to kind of run into people in the studio and talk about our projects and kind of getting inspiration that way. The other struggle has kind of been getting up to campus for me personally, because I only have one in-person class. And so, I used to spend all my free time in the art building. And so deliberately going up to campus has been kind of a trek, especially in the rain. So I've been doing a lot of projects in my room, which takes up a lot of space, but there's definitely been a lot of positives in terms of like just being able to make it work. And I feel very fortunate that although I do have to adapt, I'm still able to access the studios and the wood shop. And so I'm very, very fortunate to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, going off of what Nicole was saying, is I think it's important to keep in mind in the context of the larger university that, our cohort has a lot more access to opportunities and facilities than the rest of the university does right now, because we have keys to the building and we have permission to pretty much go wherever we want, whenever we want. Whereas a lot of other students are not allowed in the building unless they have in-person classes. So I would say that the effect of the challenges we have in making art are a lot different than the challenges that the other art students are probably having right now.
Yeah, Julia mentioned in the chat that even staff and faculty are having a hard time getting access. And I mean, I'm student staff technically, and I still have to make an appointment and do the attestation to get into the VU. But if any of y'all want a study space outside of your home, the Viking Union has opened up the multi-purpose room for folks to do that, which is great. At least it's something.
That's awesome. I didn't know that they were doing that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it works. I think you also have to make, actually, I don't think you have to make an appointment. I think you can just go on the high street entrance, and then you have to do like an attestation, or they might take your temperature. But I've noticed through conversations with other students that no matter what their major is, that doing everything from home is like really reaching like a breaking point for a lot of folks, and being able to find those additional spaces where you can work on whatever it is that your work is constitutive of and do it well. Yeah, I know that that's a real problem for lots of folks.
It
I
definitely
think that's something that I've
Go ahead.
struggled with. Sorry, that's something I've struggled with a lot. Is just really the lack of structure, because the BFA program is already kind of a loosely structured program, just because we get to kind of do what we want for the most part. And I have ADHD, so I really, really need structure to have like any motivation. And just like not having that has made just making art has been so challenging without that like daily thing to wake up for and go to and like a place to go. It's just like it's been really challenging for sure.
We can always circle back to some questions if folks want to add anything a little later. That's totally fine. But we can move on and ask another one. So the two shows, Inside Out and Outside In, otherwise known as the Inside Outside Project, focuses on what is now this liminal space between inside and outside the safety of one's own home. So could some of you speak to this concept and how it was important for the BFA's Winter Showcase to reflect on this experience?
Well, when we started talking about these two shows at the beginning of this year, which would have been the beginning of last quarter, we were looking at the situation that art in general was going through, which is that galleries were closing. And, you know, normally an online exhibition is not really considered an important part of any type of gallery exhibition because work is just so much easier to understand in person. But because everything was closing, we felt like this was going to be a point maybe in the larger history of art where people look at the way online exhibitions are run and set up and what they want out of online exhibitions. So when we started talking about doing two shows and doing an online show, I think we started talking about the ways that we wanted our work to be displayed online and what we liked, how we liked our work to be displayed versus other ways that they had been. And we thought that it would be important to sort of lay out our own show. And of course, that immediately ran into problems because of bureaucracy and the school. And that sort of highlights how even though this situation has been going on for almost a year, bureaucracy doesn't move that fast. So even though we wanted more resources, those resources really didn't exist. So that's how we ended up with two online shows that are a little bit different in layout and in content. And I think they kind of highlight the different types of shows that can go on in the online space. I hope that that was an understandable ramble, but I guess that was the general idea. And here we are.
Yeah, that was great.
I think one of the things that's been really crazy to think about is how quickly we've kind of building off what Haley said, how quickly we've needed to adapt. And like just in terms of being able to access the studios and stuff, we owe a lot of those opportunities to last year's BFA cohort who were like really, really locked out of the studios when everything shut down in March and April, May and June, and so forth. And so part of me is really happy to and really grateful to them for being able to go through that and being able to kind of set the precedent so we're able to have access. But there's also definitely something that's kind of terrifying about leaving your home these days. And a lot of my work, I've been trying to kind of cope with like all these new feelings where it's like, oh, I want to be outside and I want to see people, I want to do things. But every time, you know, I go to the grocery store, all of a sudden, like this just kind of casual panic sets in. And so that's really translated into my art, and just kind of trying to understand this sense of isolation and just really trying to adjust. And as much as I'm like attempting, you know, happy hour Zoom calls and like doing things virtually, it's scary to be kind of on your own and not really knowing what's going to happen, and everything feels so up in air. And so I think it's definitely affected the way that people are thinking about art and making art, and then even transitioning to digital platforms and just thinking about how your art is being shared on a digital platform opens up a whole array of choices, which I can barely use Google Docs. So web design is a whole other beast for me. And so it's really interesting to see how we've changed. And I think going forward and hopefully after the pandemic, it'll be interesting to see what sticks and what changes when we're finally be able to see each other in person.
Yeah. Thinking about like the two shows and these like two spaces, one being like a physical space and the other this digital space, has made me really think about like documentation of my work. I'm sure that's something that we're all thinking about right now. Especially those of us who do installation, like it's so hard for that to translate through photos. I find like sculpture really loses its scale, which is an important part. So one thing we did this time around is Haley very kindly photogrammetrized some of our sculptures, which is where like a bunch of photos are compiled into a 3D object. And so for me, that was just like a very interesting way to think about my work and to experience my work, and something that I hadn't done before, but that I think is kind of trending towards the new normal. You know, I think we're going to see a lot more of these digital shows as people have kind of adapted to doing them and see the benefits not only within a pandemic but like outside of it too. It makes art more accessible, and it's easier for people to start their own galleries and do like bootleg shows if they don't have to have a physical space. So I think it's kind of changing how we as artists kind of conceptualize our work and how it'll be received, especially in sculpture.
Yeah, I might give a bit of context to that. The process I used was, you can see, I think there's 2 or 3 examples of this on the BFA site. It's called photogrammetry, which is a process of photographing an object from multiple angles all the way around it, and then putting it through a algorithm which reads the photos and recreates a 3D model based on those. And I just thought it was really interesting that that sort of technology has only become sort of viable to a lay person really recently, like within the last few years. And you know, that was just something I thought would be really useful for sculpture students, since photographing sculptures is so challenging, right?
I think speaking to Henry's like another look at scale though is that for me at least, I've been doing a lot of small models, and what I like about the whole digital space is that you don't know how big my models are or if they're even models. So like to that end, like it's like a whole nother distortion of concepts of space and size, scale, shape, dimension, whatever you want to name it. But like I think that's another way you can look at it as well.
Yeah, for sure. It was it was kind of fascinating to see the way detail gets distorted through that process. Yeah, just like another interesting kind of, yeah, another layer that one could put over their work.
I'll just say as a sculptor that that photographing the work is almost like another part of the work, and you can totally embrace that. Especially working with scale, you know, don't discount your photographs or your documentation of the work. It's another aspect of it that can be part of it. And especially when I was working in smaller scale, I was making diorama, I felt like the photographs were actually more successful. So I think working in the way we do as spatial artists, we can decide what the art is. And documentation, considering the fact that most people pre or post pandemic will be seeing our work on a screen. And so being comfortable with that, I think, is really important. And what's really, I was actually had a hallway conversation with Cara recently, and we were talking about this cohort in particular, and how you guys are really great, actually, like, and you know, for all your different reasons, but part of it is probably because you had 2 solid years at least of face-to-face community building, physical material experimentation, and now you're being put into, you know, you've been had to just completely turn your practices upside down, and you are proving yourself to be quite resilient and creative in that. And I think it's because you've had that physical experience, and it's gonna be really valuable, I think, for you guys moving forward. However the art world goes, I feel like we're never going to completely erase what's happened here. I think that having online exhibitions, which I think is important, I think more accessibility, the better. You know, like, make your own opportunities, have online galleries, create the work, curate the work. Don't wait around for some institution to give you a stamp of approval. So even though this time has been very disruptive and disturbing, it's also made us more flexible, and I think prepared for whatever we need to do to get our work out there to connect with our audience. So I think this is going to be good for you guys.
Yeah, a lot of great points there, Sasha. I've noticed in some conversations I've had with other folks in the art world, doing additional programming with associated student productions. We are seeing this shift from begrudgingly using the internet to show work to embracing it. And I think that accessibility is one of the greatest advantages that's come with utilizing the resources that we have, and in learning about how to use those resources that maybe we weren't using before. So we can, of course, continue to talk about this topic, but most of the questions are pretty related. So feel free to touch back on this at any point. But I'll go ahead and ask this next question. So some of the work in the show in Inside Out was started before the pandemic, and some of it doesn't directly reference your respective experiences of the pandemic. So could those of you who would describe your work in these ways talk about how, if at all, the work functions differently in our current viewing context?
can.
Oh, go ahead, Emma.
Okay. I think, and this is like kind of related to some of the things that have been said already. You know, it's really great to try and to like find silver linings in something so terrible. I think everything that people have said about accessibility is really wonderful. But ultimately, I'm always going to be resentful of the fact that of how much agency I think we've lost as artists in how our work is perceived. We will never be able to like remove the association of the pandemic with our art. We have no agency in that at all. And no matter what we want to talk about, it's always going to be like the art that was made during the pandemic. And I find that incredibly frustrating. And that is just something that like really bothers me as someone that's not really making art that has anything to do with the pandemic. And I feel like the direction my art has gone, it probably would have gone that direction either way for the most part. So that's something I've really been like struggling to kind of grapple with, like figuring out how to accept the fact that that's always, it's just going to be that way, you know, it's just going to be pandemic art, I guess, you know.
I totally agree. I think especially because we're still in the midst of this, it's really hard to view our work collectively through any lens other than like our shared experience of being BFA students during a pandemic. And that tends to be like what gets focused on. And it can be really frustrating because I don't think my work is very related to the pandemic directly. It's definitely influenced by it. There's decisions that I've for sure made that I wouldn't have made otherwise, but like the general themes have remained the same. And going back to like what Henry and Danielle said earlier, like detail and scale are so important to my work that it can be like really heartbreaking to have such a small amount of people get to see my work in person when all I want to do is make larger and larger paintings. But I do think that accessibility is the silver lining that is really giving me hope, because that's something that I would really like to fight for in the art world. And like, I don't think that you should have to be able to pay to like go to a museum to be exposed to work. And I think we can all agree on that. So that's always nice.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm reiterating what Emma was saying, but I think it's important to remember that everyone in the group sort of had to think to themselves and decide actively whether they wanted to be in this program before they even ever were, a year before. And I'm sure a lot of us in that process would have been thinking about, well, what would I do if I was in this program? And so a lot of our ideas and our thinking processes started well before the pandemic ever began. I know I had a lot of ideas for things I wanted to do, and those ideas admittedly had to change because of the pandemic, but the concepts are often still the same because it's the same things that you care about and that you want to make art about. So there's definitely, I can see Sasha has a note here about attention span, and I agree, in a few years, people probably won't think about it in the same way that we are right now, where everything has to be linked to the pandemic. But the fact that it so dominates our conversation all the time can be really, really frustrating when you have this other conversation in your mind about what you're actually making art about, right? But that's the sticks. That's what you get. I don't know.
Well, I'm just gonna say, like, there's these other things that happened in the world before the pandemic. Maybe like the Vietnam War or World War II, or World War I, or other like overthrows of power that maybe were depicted on Greek vessels in ancient Greece. This is what we need to 9/11. I didn't even mention 9/11, you know. This is what this is just the way it is. Like, I think that as artists, when there are these incredible episodes in human civilization, you may be drawn, your work may change. I think that is a normal tendency. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be obvious. It doesn't have to be deliberate, but I think unconsciously your work will be affected. It's part of your job, I think, as artists, as sort of you translate cultural phenomenon into something that is experiential, and what is happening in the world around you is going to have an effect on what you're doing. You can resist it, of course, but your work is still going to be affected by it. But I don't think it's anything you need to feel bad about. I think that how your life experience pushes you and how you push against it is your creative practice and your journey as an artist. And there could be other things more devastating. And you're going to keep making art about what you think is important.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, everyone, that I am in a unique position because I think I'm the only one who's making artwork that specifically relates to my experience throughout the pandemic. And it's kind of the thing where there was art that was made during World War II, and then there's art made about World War II. And so seeing that kind of distinction, I think in later years, that distinction will be more and more prominent in terms of like how we are looking at art. But it's definitely interesting to see how something so unprecedented has affected the way we make art and even the way we think about the other themes in our artwork.
Yeah. Speaking of like maybe a distortion of themes through the pandemic, I think a lot of my work, which is environmentally focused, is born out of like a low-level background panic, and to have like another layer on top of that is in a way related, like the levels of deforestation that put people into more contact with wild animals, like leads to more exposure to zoonotic diseases, which this is. It's just been interesting to grapple with like the fact that it's kind of related in that way, but then also unrelated. I don't want my work to be overtly about the pandemic, but then it exists in like a kind of parallel space. Which, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's it's a funny place to be.
Yeah, I've noticed, so right before Inside Out, we had a solo show with Kayla Nygren, who also, her work focuses on environmental issues. And in our conversation, we talked a lot about sustainability and how strange it is that she makes this kind of work with this environmental lens, and then coincidentally, we're suddenly talking about that environmental work in the midst of an environmental catastrophe, which is what this is. And there's a lot of science to support that we will continue to see pandemics with climate change. And I think that that's something new that I will now bring to future conversations around environmental artwork that I don't think I would have brought there before. And whether or not that's good or bad, I don't know. But it's definitely something that's on my mind now, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's good. The more informed we are and the better we understand the impacts of climate change, I think the more, or I hope, the more motivated we are to do something about it. You know, this is pretty horrific. And if that's a motivator, then better than not.
Mm-hmm. So we've already touched on my next two questions pretty thoroughly, and I'm hearing what everyone is saying, that they want to talk about what their work is about rather than making the work in this context. And I apologize, a lot of my questions are really pandemic focused, but given our time constraints and given the way that the shows are presented, it just made sense. But I want to throw it out there that if anyone wants to take some additional time throughout the next 2 weeks of the show being open, and it'll be available, at least on the VU Gallery website, pretty much indefinitely until my successor decides otherwise. So I want to throw out an invitation now that if any of you want to speak about your work specifically in a one-on-one or something like this in the future, maybe next week, hit me up. I am so down to do that, because a lot of your work is, by your, I mean the collective, it all could easily give way to another hour-long conversation about the topics that are dealt with there. So let me know if that's something that any of you want to do individually, and I'm happy to facilitate that. But now that I've said that, I feel a little strange asking my remaining questions, but if anyone wants to chime in who hasn't yet on these two things, like I said, I think have been touched on already, two things really. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages that you found with showing work online? And I know that we've touched on that a lot, actually, but if there's anything else that hasn't been said, I'd like to hear it. And then my other question was, does anyone feel pressured to create work that reflects the pandemic or the time that we're living in? And perhaps for Nicole, maybe that has come really naturally to make work about your experience, what you're doing in life at the moment. If anyone else wants to speak on either of those things.
I think, about pressure, I think it's interesting to me, and it's not necessarily so based solely on the pandemic, but I find that people who don't really follow art or artists, or they might have an artistic friend that they just see here and there, I feel like those people often expect you to make work about whatever's going on in the times, which I just find interesting. That's just kind of a comment I have, but so I mean, I know I've had friends, I've had conversations with friends where they're like, "What kind of work are you making right now? Is it about this or that?" And I'm like, "No, not at all." So I think that's to answer your pressure question. I think with the community we have now, I don't feel any pressure, but anywhere outside that, there's definitely an expectation, quote unquote, to fulfill a I don't know, artistic goal or something about, I guess now, the pandemic or whatever is going on.
Yeah, I think the only pressure I feel is the pressure of the Western Gallery show, and just of the BFA program in general. I think being in the program and having that opportunity kind of at the end, and that looming due date is really what lights the fire under my butt more than anything else. And that's not really exactly the answer to your question, but
I've personally never felt a shred of pressure to make work about the pandemic, honestly, like not at all. I've hardly even thought about making work about it. And I think I owe that a lot to my committee members, and honestly, like this cohort, like no one has like really suggested anything kind of like out of pocket about what we should be working with thematically. And most people seem to have had like a set group of themes that they enjoy working with, that they feel like they can express well. And there's definitely never been any pressure at all. For me personally, I feel like most people can agree to make work about the pandemic. And I think especially my committee members have always been like supportive of my ideas, and they've hardly even brought up the pandemic as a possible theme for me. So personally, I haven't felt pressure at all. The only pressure I felt is the deadline, and then, having to work in some of the constraints that we have because of the pandemic. But yeah.
Emma, I totally agree. And what you were saying about like our cohort and your committee members, I totally agree with that. You guys have all been like the main support throughout this whole thing. And I think that that's why it sucks so much, like when those community aspects get taken away because of the pandemic. But I think we kind of exist in this little bubble of like, we're literally all in the same boat and we all have the deadline that is impending. And so we kind of just get to do whatever like we want to talk about. And it's only after we like our bubble is like temporarily burst and like you go back to your family and they're like, well, what are you painting or what are you sculpting? And sometimes they're like, is it about coronavirus? Yeah.
I personally use my artwork, and it's always kind of been this way to process like a lot of things that I'm going through. And I use it as a way to kind of like help me understand like my feelings and my emotions. And I know that's not the same for everyone, but so I think mostly like that's kind of been my focus in terms of like the work that I've been creating. When it comes to the pressure that I feel to make work, it took a while. Definitely during fall quarter, I felt kind of like a personal pressure on myself, where I had to kind of let myself be less productive than I've been. And like even in April, when I was trying to accept that none of my plans for spring quarter were going to happen, and that all these like grandiose plans I had for this year and all these like grandiose ideas I had and all these projects I wanted to do weren't going to happen. And that even just in terms of like homework and school, that I wasn't going to be able to work and make in the same capacity that I worked and made before the pandemic, because there's all these other things. Like I feel emotionally and physically less able to expand myself like that. And so, having all these worries and stuff, it's been hard to make like a lot of art. And so I've really focused in on, big pieces that take a long time. Just because kind of the way that I see time and the way that I'm experiencing time has really slowed down, but I also don't have the same capacity that I used to. And so just being able to think about about how I'm making my work in terms of like how much work I'm making has changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, to maybe go into what Nicole is saying, I think it isn't so much that there's this pressure to change your context to be about the pandemic, but rather that there's a pressure to change the type and form and scale of what you're making. And this affects, I think, performance artists and people who do interactive work more than people who do painting. Like Nicole does performance work in her maid suits. And one of the problems I know she was having is, and how do you have a performance when you can't have people in the space? And before I started the BFA, I was thinking about having interactive exhibits where you walk through tight spaces and maybe touch things and interact with things. And a lot of those plans have changed drastically, to where I can't have people touch buttons or controllers or be in any type of space that's too enclosed to be unsafe. So there is like a little bit, I guess you could call it pressure. It's more like a control on what we can put in the gallery right now that makes sense. I don't know if pressure is the right word for that, but yeah.
It's definitely a lot of new circumstances. And like with the Yeti Squatch, I've been taking it out and trying to do performance pieces in like less populated areas, in places where, you know, people aren't going to come up to me because, you know, I'm like, whoa, who's wearing a mask like 6 feet? And so I still have to figure out how to live stream. So gotta go watch some YouTube tutorials. But it's definitely affected the way that I've thought about my work and my installations and how people are going to experience them, like Haley said.
You know, we've got around 8 minutes left for our allotted time, but we can take it a few minutes longer if any of you are free to stay longer. That's fine with me. I'd rather end it in a place where it feels natural to end it than to cut anyone off too soon. So I have I'm going to skip one of my questions because I feel like it's been answered. And then the last question that I had, I think it's a good place for each of you to speak about your work specifically that's in the show currently and what you're working on for the Western Gallery and even stuff beyond that. So if you want to take some time to talk about your particular projects, I think that would now would be a good time. So my last question was, what are your hopes for your creative and professional goals for the remainder of 2021? And before anyone answers, I just want to mention that Sasha put here in the chat, limitations can lead to innovations. And also, you know, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I did have a great conversation with Jessica Gajvronsky, who's the founder of Seattle Art Post. And she and I had a really great conversation about what is going to happen in the next couple of years, knowing that the pandemic isn't really going to be over anytime soon, and that effects are going to be felt for a long time afterwards. And something that she said was that, you know, you don't have to stop making work, and instead what you have to do is figure out how to a way to get the work that you want to make in the way that you want to make it to other people. And there are options for that. And I think that's what we're finding. So I would love to hear from each of you, or at least those of you who want to speak on it, what you hope to do with your current and your future projects moving forward.
I'm happy to start. So last quarter, I finished what I think is like one of my more ambitious sculptures. And this is what ended up in both of these shows, displayed in slightly different ways, as we had mentioned before. But it takes the shape of a stump with a like kind of altar-esque styling and a tree growing out of the middle of it. And it was
I guess I'll go second. Kind of going along with Henry is that idea of scale, and instead of like, I think I'm playing tricks here because my idea is to like project scale and using light and stuff like that and shadows. So I've always been like fascinated with like spaces, I guess, and like home spaces that are familiar to everyone, or particularly myself, but mostly everyone. And so I kind of want to just like encapsulate people in a space that isn't physically there, because that's kind of what we're doing right now. Is we're kind of trapped in a space, but we can't really, feel it or touch it, but it's there. So that's where I'm going with my work.
Are you guys hearing that noise? Okay, it just went away. Never mind.
Yeah, I think it's
Amber alert.
I think it's an Amber alert. Wow, that's intense. The idea of scale and space, and also just taking advantage of all the new alternative platforms to make your work accessible, to make art events. Maybe you don't have a gallery, but you can get your friends together and have a spontaneous performance somewhere, and document it, and then that's like it happened, and that's art that's done. We had a lot of experience with sound art in my classes recently, and it keeps going. Now that sound art piece we did last quarter is going to be in the Spark Museum. So like thinking of ways to disseminate your work that is accessible, doesn't involve people being close together, but also is still like, has an intimate quality, and I think like sound is something that's very intimate. You hear it goes in your ears and you can feel it. So yeah, I think this experience, even though it's been very, very, very disruptive and challenging and completely like world changing, may make you more prepared to create and curate your own careers. Like, no, the public needs art, and we're not going to wait around, and we're going to do it carefully and responsibly, and this is what we can do.
Speaking of sound, I can go next. My work has, well, overall, my work has always really talked about the relationship and the balance between life and death and nature. And it particularly manifests through dead birds. so the work that I've displayed in the B gallery in Outside In is this painting of a dark-eyed junco that Lisanne found, who's another member of the cohort. It had collided with a window on campus, and I basically took it and I blew up the picture that I took of it and then painted it in like this luscious floral grave. And the other piece that is shown in the VU gallery and also in the B gallery website is this systems project that I did in experimental drawing with Kara, where I am trying to figure out ways to incorporate sound into my paintings to make them like more all-encompassing of like multiple senses, especially if people will be viewing them not in person, so that they're more immersive. And in the systems project, I basically did these sketches of birds, and then as they were in front of me, I was recording the sounds around me. So one of them, like I'm in the Zoom call, and then another one, I'm like on a walk with a friend, and then in another one, there's construction. So it's been really interesting to find out how sound and images like have this interplay. And moving forward, I think well, in the Western Gallery, I'm planning on making 4 like 6-foot long paintings of these birds and experimenting with using sound. But I think all
Well, we have some technology in the art department that is called a touch board. It's very like it's better used very simply, but basically it has touch and proximity built into it, and it uses very simple coding that you could just copy and paste, so that if you get close to an object, it will trigger sound.
Yeah, I remember when you talked about that to our art and ecology class in the fall.
Yeah. So if you want to talk, we've got those boards in the art department, and you can check some out, and we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
that'd be fun.
I can segue
Oh no,
off that.
Haley can totally show you how it
because
goes. Yeah.
My project has a touch board in it. Ta-da!
I love that you guys are using boards. It makes me glad.
Yeah, I think when what I was working, or what my plans were before things really started to go pear-shaped, was to do an installation based on some of the really large installation works I had seen on trips abroad. And I sort of realized as soon as things started going badly that that wasn't going to be very reasonable, since I didn't know what limitations I was going to have. And in the quarter where everything was entirely online in the spring, I had no physical space to really do installation in or try to do anything like that. And I started looking at different types of virtual spaces, which is a really nice way of saying I started playing a lot of video games. And I realized at that point that that little hemisphere of art was having a really weird change, where the tools and the abilities to work with that type of art was changing really quickly because the tools were becoming more available. And just like the touch board is something you can buy that only costs like $60 or so, and it allows you to add interactivity into your art, which is a technology that would have been really, really hard to do before. And there's other technologies, like I work with the program Unity, which is a game engine. And it's really unique because it has 2 documentation manuals that have been written by the developers that explain how to use it. And because of that, it's incredibly easy to use. And you can do all of these complicated things that, 5 or 10 years ago would have just been completely beyond you. So I guess that's sort of what my work is about right now. I'm still doing painting to try and combine these two things, but that's the weird direction I've veered off in. If someone else would now like to talk about themselves.
I can go. So my work is primarily 2D mixed media collage, a lot of acrylic paint and images for magazines and a little bit of printmaking and drawing and things like that. And it's very process driven and experimental, like nothing's really planned at all. I just kind of like go into it and see how it goes and just kind of respond to what's happening as I'm creating it. And I started developing that kind of approach like a year ago, a little over a year ago. It's been working really well for me because I'm not really great with planning and it really stresses me out and I feel like it makes my art worse when I plan too much. But like thinking about like changing formats of how art is being viewed, I think a lot about materiality. That's very, very important to my work, I think, is just textures in general and colors and just being able to see all the undulations in the texture. And a lot of that is really lost when you're looking at a small photo online or whatever. You can't see it in person, so you can't see all the texture. And that really got me thinking about ways to highlight the texture in a work that is does focus a lot on materiality. So then I was kind of thinking about the idea of like zooming in, which is something that's nice that you can do like on Instagram or whatever. You can like, if it's a good picture, you can zoom in and you can see things pretty well. But especially if it's a detail photo, like you'd see in like an art history class or something, if you're looking at a work of art, a lot of times they'll show you detail shots that are, you know, really zoomed in high quality photos where you can see all the paint or whatever it is. And I've always really loved those photos. So like with all those ideas in mind, I started taking up close pictures of the collages and making those kind of their own work of art. And so in the VU gallery, I have 2 of those photos that are shown. And then one is just a mixed media collage. And in the B gallery, I have 4 collages. But that's kind of a new idea that I'm working with, is like this idea of kind of zooming in so you can like really see what's going on, and then go like working with that, kind of creating new compositions by layering multiple collages together and finding ways to connect them. So yeah, 2 of my works in the VU gallery are just photographs of collages that are layered on top of each other. So I think that is, I will say, like a development to my work that came about partially because of the pandemic, just like thinking about how I can show the materiality of something when it can't be seen in person. So, yeah.
I think I have to agree with Emma on the kind of missing the being able to see the details and the close-ups. Like my entire sculpture is made out of yarn, and so seeing that up close is like really exciting to see, and being able to watch how it moves and stuff is really exciting. And so I think there's a part of me that's sad that that is really hard to translate online.
Yeah, so some of y'all have to leave, and that's okay. I totally understand. If everyone's cool leaving now, that's fine. But if anyone else wants to stick around and like have their thoughts recorded, I'll continue the recording until everyone wants to go. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining me and chatting about the show and this weird context. And you know, hopefully next time we get to chat about the BFA work, that we're talking about the work and not just the experience of making it, which has been so weird and dominating. So yeah, thanks y'all.